Almost every week, it seems as if there is another revelation shining the light on the extent to which mass migration is being used to fill the so-called labour gap. And while the government has declared its intention to implement the largest ever reduction in net migration, it has been revealed that overseas applications for teacher training have doubled this year after a government recruitment drive offered £10,000 payments to foreign teachers to come to Britain. At the heart of net migration is the issue of economics. Many have pointed out that mass migration is not economically beneficial. But today, a Conservative MP, Neil O'Brien, has revealed that HMRC, His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, is hiding the figures which would allow people to calculate the fiscal effect of migration. It already does not publish welfare claims broken down by original nationality, but has now stopped publishing data on tax contributions by nationality too. This is a strange decision to have made, as at the heart of the migration debate is the economic consequence. Well, with me now is the UK's leading demographer, Paul Morland, as well as my panel, Nunziata Rees-Mogg and Amy Nicole-Turner. Paul, thank you very much. We've got this migration issue, 1.4 million net in the 2 years to the middle of 2023, 1.4 million visas then issued in 2023, and yet we've got 5.5 million people economically inactive. So to what extent is it demographic, and to what extent is it that we're not using the resources that we've got properly?
Well, back in the 60s, a lot of women didn't work, and back in the 80s, there were a lot of unemployed. Today, there are these people not working who we would like to work, and for various reasons aren't. And I'm not for a moment saying it's inevitable or nothing can be done about it. But actually, if you look at the share of people of working age who are actually in the labour market, and then that data goes back to the 19th century, by historic standards, it's very high. So there's no doubt we could do more to get more people into the labour force, but at the same time, we have to recognise that can only go so far. The fundamental problem of the British labour market is not whether we can squeeze an extra 100 or 200,000 out of that group of people, but the fact that we've had 50 years of not having enough children, and there simply aren't enough people coming into the workforce compared to those leaving it. It was 2 to 1 when I started in the workplace in the 80s. Now it's barely 1 to 1.
And this is then an issue for pensions, where the number of people in work supporting pensioners is declining, making the pensions a bigger burden for the working population. But if you didn't have mass migration, wouldn't this be a big incentive to increase productivity, which the UK economy has miserably failed in for the last 30 years?
There's no doubt our productivity has been really disappointing, even by international standards. But it's quite striking how across the developed world, productivity has been really flat. And that's something that economists wrestle with. But just as I don't think squeezing that 500,000 stock of people and getting another 100 or 200,000 out to work is going to be the solution, nor do I believe that there's a magic productivity solution. There's no doubt that by mass immigration, we do, on the margin, discourage investment in labour-saving investment. There's no doubt about that. But that can only go so far. I think a more practical approach is to look at immigration and say, where do we really need immigrants to fill labour gaps? And where do we not? Do we need such huge numbers of people coming into the country, for example, to attend not very good universities, or even not attend not very good universities, and then never leave? So really, I think you need to look at immigration as part of the solution to the labour problem, which itself is a result of not having enough children, but to laser focus it on that issue alone.
And what are other countries doing to solve this problem? Because we know that South Korea and Japan are more advanced down this route of not replacing their population. How are they solving the problem?
Well, they're not really. I mean, Japan has got very low labour productivity anyway, and certainly could do more in that respect. It is actually having some immigration, although very limited immigration. But the Japanese economy has been flatlining since the late 80s. Government debt to GDP in Japan, which is the other aspect of the problem that you're talking about, where we not only have the pensions issue, but an 80-something has a much higher burden, is a much higher burden on the health service than a 20-something. In Japan, the government debt to GDP ratio is 250%. When we were approaching 100%, the market seemed to panic. Now, why Japan can get as far away with 250 is another question, but they are going to hit a bump in the road.
That's an interesting question, and Japan's domestic savings and so on will tie into that. But what about Neil O'Brien's revelation that HMRC is withdrawing some of the historic information that it used to dish out? It's a very odd thing to do, isn't it? Because it makes it much harder to see what the economic benefit is of migration and therefore to make suitable policy around it.
Well, I don't know why they've done that, and I think he should ask a follow-up question as to why. But I think it's absolutely shocking that as this debate gets going, as we have more and more immigrants, and therefore it's totally legitimate to be debating this, that they're closing down the information. I don't want to suppose that it's due to bad faith, but I think he should be probing why that is, because if the fundamental argument for immigration is economic, we really need the economic data in order to make the case or not. And if they're covering it up, it makes you think something dodgy is going on, whether it is or not.
Always right, isn't it, Amy, that if something's being covered up, you think something dodgy is going on.
But what was the word you used there? It was mainly driven by economics, because I don't think it is necessarily. I think it's just driven by they've run out of options, and it's a very practical solution because we basically do not maintain our workforce. It's like a car, we don't look after it. So I was shocked today to read about the number of 16 to 24-year-olds who are economically inactive. And it wasn't due to laziness, it was due to poor health, poor mental health, poor physical health, not feeling like you could be part of the workforce. So I think our society, we need to step up and look after that and attend to that and look after it as if it was a car.
But I think, Nancy, I don't know if you agree, that using migration in teaching is an easy option and that it's to do with pay and it's to do with trying to fill gaps quickly, whereas there's an apprentice scheme for people to go into teaching who haven't got degrees, and they suddenly say they haven't got the money for that, for local people. This is a really odd way of approaching things.
And there have been plans to scrap repayments on loans for people who go into the areas of teaching that have the biggest shortages, mainly the STEM science subjects. The average physics teacher starts on 35 grand a year. You have done 4 years of a physics degree, you have done your QTS qualified training, teacher training, and people aren't prepared to do it. What we've got to do is look at that fundamental problem. Yes, fine, use teachers from another country in the short term to plug a gap, but we shouldn't be training them from scratch. We should be training our own people to do these jobs and making them attractive enough that they will relocate from other areas.
Isn't Paul's point broadly right? You've got to work out where the gaps are that you need to fill, and you have to pay people more in other areas.
Yeah.
I've slightly extrapolated your point.
The gaps are absolutely everywhere. And when you look at the labour shortages list of unskilled workers on the government website, it's basically every profession.
And I think that's why it's ultimately...
It's even things like graphic designers.
It's ultimately
we have a shortage of.
Demographic issue, because today we're talking
we
about...
literally haven't got enough
Today
people.
we're talking about teachers. 2 years ago we were talking about lorry drivers or tanker drivers. Next week we'll be talking about doctors and nurses. You can throw money at any one sector, but it's like whack-a-mole. When you've sold that particular sector, if you've got a lack of workers relative to the population because of demographic issues, a problem will pop up elsewhere.
Is the problem not really that our entire welfare state, particularly for pensioners, is set up essentially as a Ponzi scheme where you constantly need younger people feeding in to pay for the outcomes at the end of one's life? And that is not sustainable. No Ponzi scheme has ever been sustainable, and that needs a structural change in itself.
It would be feasible if we were having 2 to 3 children. We don't have to follow the exemplary case of some of our leading politicians, but 2 to 3 rather than 1 to 2. And the fact we've had below replacement since the 70s, it takes a while to feed through, but when it does, you have labour shortages in all sorts of areas, and 2 to 3 will keep the sort of pyramid that would allow the economy to function normally. We don't need to have
All right, so we've all got to have lots of children. GB News viewers, pay attention. More children, the merrier. 6 is a good starting point.